Have you ever felt like an outsider? Most of us have, at one time or another, experienced the pain of feeling like we don't belong, though some of us face this more often because of various aspects of our identity. This week, I talked with Naeemah Elias, founder of Elias Presence Ventures, about how to navigate experiences when you feel like an outsider. Here, Naeemah shares her journey of working her way out of poverty and into a degree from Harvard, and the experiences of feeling like an outsider along the way. In particular, we talk about the ways in which she adopted different personas to fit each situation rather than lean into an authentic self, an approach that's all too familiar to me because of my own experience, which I share here as well. We also talk about actions you can take to counteract these negative feelings and thrive as an outsider. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Menninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Naeemah. It is so wonderful to have you here today, and I would love to start by inviting you to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kim. So my name is Naeemah Elias. I am a mother of three, survivor of sort of early childhood trauma. I grew up in poverty and had, I think, a lot of interesting challenges kind of getting out of the poverty space and into sort of living what was possible in my life. I grew up in a town called Harvey, Illinois, and with a focus on education, went to Harvard. And so that was sort of a big deal and a big transition. And really one of the first sort of major spaces where I felt like I absolutely did not belong. And so I went on from Harvard to become a professional actress. After some years acting, I went on and built a corporate career. And now I am a mother of no longer three teenagers. I now have a 20-year-old. So 16, 18, 20, which is crazy. And I run my own practice with a focus on what I call thriving as an outsider. And so I think I spend a lot of time sort of thinking and talking about imposter syndrome from different lenses. And the idea of being an outsider, identifying as an outsider, and what it means to thrive, even though you feel like you don't belong in different spaces. So excited to kind of talk about this space and how it's affected, my life, and happy to take any questions that you have.
Yeah, I'm so thrilled to bring your perspective to this conversation because you just completely caught my attention when you talked about going to Harvard and having grown up in poverty, and I would love to hear more about what that experience was like for you, and just the feelings that you had and how you were able to, and I don't know if it got better, but I just want to hear what did it look like and feel like.
Yeah. So the experience of Harvard was just really weird, right? I grew up in poverty. I went to public schools. I didn't have private tutors. My education was fine. It wasn't amazing. I got to school and I discovered that, my classmates had traveled the world. They learned about things firsthand from actually being in physical spaces. They had tutors. They went to boarding schools. The kids that I went to school with, like some of their names were on the buildings. And so the reality of their experience was so far removed from mine. And then sitting in classes, not even in classes, sitting in the dining hall, and kids would tell jokes referencing Shakespeare. And at this point, I think I had read Romeo and Juliet and I had read a piece of the Scottish play, right? And so very limited exposure to Shakespeare and definitely could not joke in Shakespeare. And, and so realizing how little I had read in comparison to my classmates. Growing up, I loved to read, and I read the Grimm's fairy tales and everything Stephen King ever wrote and things like that. I was not reading the great classics. And so the having the realization that I did not know nearly as much as my classmates knew. And I don't know, I had this moment where I decided that I needed to accept that there was a distinction between knowledge and intelligence. And
Mm.
my complete lack of knowledge did not undermine the fact that I was intelligent and capable. But it meant that the ladder was so much steeper. I had so much more that I had to learn, so much more that I had to figure out in order to compete. And it was, competition in order to kind of compete successfully in that space. So it was a lot. And I definitely, people would say, oh yeah, we're going to go out to eat. And I'm like, I can't afford to go out to eat, right? Like I have to eat in the dining halls, right? And everything that I did was really based on what was offered to me as part of the college experience and never or very rarely things that I had to actually pay for on my own.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And I had a somewhat similar experience I went to Boston College. I didn't go to Harvard, but I went to a school the only reason I could go was because we were so poor that I could get financial aid, right?
Same, same.
And so I found myself too surrounded by people who were going on spring break and were flying all over for summer vacations, and their social lives were so much more expensive than I could have ever afforded. And there is such high pressure at that point in your life to want to fit in, right?
Mhm.
And so you just are that much more aware of your differences when
That's
you
right.
are in environments like that. And I think, when you talk about thriving as an outsider, I think it's such an important, like, every one of us has a different experience. We all experience outsidership, so to speak, through a different lens. But we all know that feeling to some extent, and it's incredibly painful. And I wonder, just given what you described as your experience, how did you get through it? Were there coping strategies that you used? Were you just like counting the days? Like how did it work in practice, in your everyday life? Like how did you
Well, I think in the beginning, I did a lot of pretending. I,
mm,
I had to, I sort of crafted personas.
mm,
I presented myself as being, what I thought I needed to be to fit in these situations. And I crafted personas all the way into my 30s. I would always, I got to be really good at stepping into a space, sizing up the people and the scenario, and presenting what I thought the scenario required or what I thought the people required. And so my authentic self wasn't a thing. Like it wasn't that I wasn't presenting it, it didn't exist. It was always, what does the situation require? And that was my coping mechanism. And I looked up at one point and realized I had different personalities for various different friend groups, different organizations, and it built, right. Like I did that well into my 20s. I was an actress, and so I was very good at playing roles. And I remember before we got to Harvard, right? So going to my interview for Harvard, my mom came with me, and the interviewer sort of sat her in another room. We were at his house. He sat her in another room, and then he took me into his office, closed the door. We sat down. We had the conversation, and then when we got back in the car to leave, I asked my mom. I said, "Were you listening?" And she said, "Oh, of course. I was standing next to the door listening the whole time." And I said, "Well, what did you think?" And she's like, "You were your usual phony self." And I was like, oh. And so I think I had already started this concept of being what the situation required before I got to Harvard, but then it just sort of exploded. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I looked up and I was like, I'm tired. I don't
mm.
want to do this anymore. It's too much work. Like keeping track of all of the different personas and being who I need to be in every situation. And what if I could just stop? And I think I was about 34 or 35, and I was just tired, and I was going through a divorce, and I had just moved to a new town, and like there were so many changes. I was like, I just want to stop. I'm so tired.
Mm.
And so at that point, I just decided, I'm like, I'm just going to do me and we'll see how that goes. And maybe people will like it, maybe they won't. But I'm going to stop and I'm just going to be me. And that created a level of vulnerability that I wasn't used to, because if people rejected a persona that I created, that wasn't me. That was a persona. They're not rejecting me because they don't know me. I don't let people know me. And when I started to actually present myself in situations, it was a very different situation because I could be personally rejected. People were reacting to the real me, and I had to grapple with that. And it did not go terribly. People did not all of a sudden decide that I was horrible and not worthy of being around, right? I had great friendships. I had great relationships. My career went really well. Things were really positive, but I was able to put more energy into the actions, the behaviors, the transformation, the work, the relationships, because I wasn't spending so much energy thinking about how I needed to show up and who I needed to be in that space.
Mm. And what you just said is really powerful too about the way in which we protect ourselves, because it's easier to have one of our personas rejected than it is to have our true selves rejected. But I also think because we are so fragile in that way, we have such a desperate need to belong that we don't often test the system, right? So we make assumptions that people aren't willing to accept us for who we are, that they're not going to grow with us. And so we have to continue to play this part, but we don't really give them a chance to let us know if that's true. And so I know the obviously the risk feels really high to be that vulnerable, but the reward is also potentially really high.
Yeah, it's fantastic, right? Like when you discover that people actually like you for who you are, when you discover that that your relationships can blossom and deepen because you allow yourself to be seen, it sort of it transforms your relationship with the world, right? And while you're creating more opportunity for more vulnerability, you're also creating the opportunity for richer, more meaningful relationships. And that is fulfilling and really very powerful.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it almost feels counterintuitive because the more vulnerable you are, obviously it feels like you are more exposed. But when you talk about deepening those relationships, you're almost less fragile when you
Yeah.
have that kind of support, right? It feels to me when you feel like you're just constantly playing this part and everything feels superficial, there's a level of fragility to that that almost feels worse, right? Than like it feels even more vulnerable than in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think, I don't know, I came full circle, right? I decided that I was going to kind of come out of my shell, that I was going to get a little bit more comfortable. I was going to play a little bit more. And then when we were planning for my 25th college reunion, I stepped all the way into the vulnerability and not voluntarily. I got kind of bullied into it by one of my classmates, but I volunteered to do a talk, and they were doing sort of 5 to 7 minutes sort of faux TED talks, and for the reunion. And this is 25 years later, so I'm out of the teenager who has no idea what's happening in the world, who's completely overwhelmed by the wealth and the privilege and all of those things, and I've gone into my career. I've built a reputation. I've built myself in business and done all of the work. And now I'm on the other side of it, and we're having conversations about like, what will my topic be? And I said, oh, well, I can talk about raising queer children. I can talk about raising Black children in white spaces. I can talk about imposter syndrome. I can talk about this with children, that with children, this, right? And my classmates said, I think that you hide behind your children. I think you use them as an excuse to not talk about yourself. So let's talk about imposter syndrome. And I was like, whoa, I just kind of threw that out there. I did not want you to bite. And and she pushed and she was like, I want to talk about this. And so we had this conversation, and I had a handler, and she was like one of my very close friends from college. And she's like, pushing me to write it and talking to me about it and everything. And so I sat down and I wrote it. And it was just like, in one sitting, I just sort of exploded out of myself. Like I sat down, I had like 2 glasses of wine, and I'm like, I'm just gonna do it. And I put it all on paper, and I shared it with her, and I was like, okay, look at it and let me know what you think. And she was just like, okay, well, I'm on my way to the gym. I'll call you later. And then like 5 minutes later, she called me and she's like, what is happening? Like, what? Like, what did I do? And she's like, this is so dark. And I said, well, what do you think imposter syndrome is? And she was just like, no, no, this is not okay. Like, do you recognize the value that you add in the world? Do you recognize the value that you bring to relationships? Like how much people, like you and want to be around you, and how amazing you are. And I was like, those are all lovely things for you to say. And I hear you and I understand you. But you asked me to write about what it feels like to be an imposter.
Mm.
And what I wrote was my experience, the fear that I carry in the world, the every time I walk into a new role, I'm looking around waiting for people to say, you have no idea what you're doing. You don't belong here. You are not trained properly. You don't have the right degrees, or all of those things. Like I expect every step of the way for people to call me out. The emperor has no clothes, right? Like you're a fraud. And that happens frequently because I change jobs every year, year and a half. And so I keep stepping into spaces where I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. And I'm constantly moving because I feel like if I keep moving, then nobody will notice that I have no idea what I'm doing, you
Mm.
know? And she's just like, but you do know what you're doing and you're great. And she's like, this is really dark. I'm like, that's what it is. Like you asked me to write about the experience that I have. And this is the experience. It's very dark. It's very scary. And I carry it everywhere, you know? And so, she made me soften it a little bit. She made me pull back on a little bit of the language, and it's posted. It's on my YouTube, and so I'll share the link with it if with you if people want to watch it. But it was a really interesting experience. And so here's what happened. I wrote it. I practiced it. I got comfortable with it. I stood in front of the room of my 25th anniversary college classmates. And, I think of them as like, the masters of the universe. These people have gone on to like run corporations and build businesses and, be incredibly like awarded artists and all of these things, like really, really incredibly, sort of titled and awarded people. And I'm standing in front of these people and just sort of revealing my soul. Um, so, so that was challenging. And after I presented, one of my classmates, who was a white male legacy, I don't know if his name was on a building, but we all knew his name before we came to Harvard, right? He came up to me afterwards and he said, Naeemah, I feel like you were telling my story.
Wow.
And I'm like, I don't understand.
Mm.
Like, that does not compute.
Mm.
And he said to me, I was born into this family. This is my grandfather's dream or my great grandfather's dream. I am required to it's this concept of being like a steward, right? Like I am a steward of my grandfather's dream and my grandfather's vision. I'm not allowed to disengage and I'm not allowed to break it.
Mm.
The entire family's legacy is sitting on my shoulders. And if I get it wrong, I'm letting down generations of people. And I was like, wow, right? Like I never would have even considered such a thing. And so the fact that I was able to step forward in front of all of my classmates and be vulnerable meant that other classmates were able to really think about their experience with imposter syndrome, and we had some really powerful conversations afterwards. And it changed my perspective, in terms of how I think about how people walk through the world and the different burdens that different people carry. Now, I'm not saying that like his struggle running a, multi-generational corporation is more difficult than my struggle, coming from poverty. But his experience is his authentic experience, and it is his own challenge and his own struggle that he has to face.
I I love that you were courageous enough to tell your story in that environment because I wish that more of us had access to the behind the scenes of each other's lives, because especially in today's social media curated world where we don't put the messy things online, right? That we often walk around feeling like everyone else has it all figured out, everyone else is so put together, and I'm just a mess and it must just be me, right? And so, like you said, I mean, there's we can empathize to whatever degree with somebody who's a multi generations of wealth and influence, but it still shows that there's a universal human struggle
Yeah.
that we can all connect and relate to, but we often feel so isolated from one another because we're not sharing it.
Yes. Yes, that's absolutely right. And one of the really cool things about my experience over the last couple of years in the coaching work that I've been doing is that, people look at me and they're just like, oh, well, you did all that stuff. Like, you went to Harvard and so everything was really easy. And so being able to say, no, actually, I struggle with various different things, right? So I'm struggling with neurodivergence. Like I have to build scaffolding and build structure to be able to function in the world every day. And I've gotten to be really good at that. And so I can navigate that. I had to get to Harvard. I had to work really hard and fight to be able to create that space for myself. And then when I graduated, I had to go out into the world and figure out how to create a life for myself with no network, no legacy. Like I didn't have the connections and all the things built in that I think a lot of my classmates did. I had to go and figure it out on my own. My family didn't have a business to pass down to me or any of those kinds of things. And so everything that I did was about me kind of stepping out on a limb. And I was constantly stepping out on a limb. I was constantly trying to figure out, how do I do this? And so when I'm coaching and I'm talking with folks who are trying to figure out like, what is this next step? And they feel like, oh, it's so terrifying. Helping them to kind of break it down, helping them to kind of pull back from the ledge and think about like, where do I want to be? What are my skills? What am I really excited about? And how do I marry the things I'm really good at with the things I'm really passionate about so that I can find the space where I can thrive and be great for myself, for my company, for my clients, and everybody that I encounter. And being able to find your way into your joy space is extremely powerful. And recognizing that most people have had to go through some sort of a path to get there. And you're not the only one who is facing struggle, who's facing challenges, I think is really helpful for people to kind of process that. Quick story. When I was working at State Street, we would bring in high school interns every summer. And one summer, I brought in a cohort of 10 students into my business, and I built a whole program around giving them exposure and relationships. And one of the things that I did was what I called a series that I called View from the Top. And in View from the Top, I asked a senior vice president or an executive vice president from each business line to come in and talk to them for an afternoon. And I asked them to tell the story of their first job, right? And to tell a little bit about their path from childhood to where they are right now. And I had all of these young, diverse, inner city kids who walked into this building and thought, these are all rich people who have always been rich and everything's always been easy for them. And when they had these executives come into the room, and one of my favorites was she talked about how her first job was working at McDonald's and she worked on fries and all she wanted was to move up to burgers. Like, that was the dream, right? Like that was the next step for her. And this is relatable to a 15-year-old sophomore who has not had their first job, or this is their first job and they're trying to figure out where they go. Like, having to take the fries out and like flip the burgers, like that is relatable. And that makes this person a real person for them. And it means that we started in similar places. And so it's possible for me to get to where you are. And so that piece, I think is really powerful. The hearing of the true stories and the understanding that, we all started somewhere. And not looking at people who have arrived and thinking like, oh, well, they had it easy. And some people do, but most people don't.
That's right. That's right. I think that's a really important thing too, is even within, existing teams or organizations, it's easy to look up and think, oh, that person could do it, but I could never do it, or, they haven't gone through what I've gone through. And of course, everybody has their own unique challenges and differences, but there is something so powerful about seeing yourself in someone else's story, even if you're very different from them in many other ways, right? And that's why I love the forums that allow for that to happen. Like, I think it is great that you made that available to these young students who probably would never have had the opportunity to connect with these, executives in other ways.
It was a really powerful experience, and it was one of the highlights for those students. I had a number of them in their, summer end feedback form say that being able to be in the room and have conversations with those executives was one of the most impactful parts of the summer for them. And then the executives stuck around and hung out and talked with them for a little bit. So they didn't just sort of come in, speak, and leave. They engaged the students and gave them the opportunity to ask questions and just kind of hang out. And so I think the more we can lean into real conversations with real people and recognize that we're all on a path. We're all on a path. And if yours sounds scary, right? If your path feels daunting or terrifying, then having some conversations, real conversations with folks offline, not looking at their Insta and their Facebook and all of the things that they do for public consumption, but really asking people to share their real experiences, their challenges, or finding forums where that's done, I think can have an impact on your belief and your ability to take those steps forward.
Yes. Yeah. And I sort of have this it's not fully formed, this thought that's flowing through my head right now, because I think about the fact that as humans, we have this just natural tendency to form in groups and out groups, right? And so when you talk about being an outsider, naturally we're talking about feeling outside of whatever the in group is of the environment that we're in. And so often the in group, it becomes sort of a product of very superficial traits that we carry around with us, whether that's our age, our gender, our race, just different aspects that we see ourselves in other people, and it brings us together because it's more obvious what that connection might look like. But what you're describing, and what I think about, is like, we can adjust the criteria for in groups. And when you say, these executives who started wanting to get to burgers from fries, right? Like, and that somebody else from a very different background has had a similar journey, they now become part of an in group that they didn't recognize existed before. So I think about this whole concept of being an outsider, like how much of so much, it sounds like so much of your worldview has been shaped by that feeling of being an outsider, but how much do you identify with being an outsider today, right? Like, how do you think about your own experience today? And do you generally still feel like an outsider, or do you find yourself feeling more like sympathetic to outsiders, but not necessarily? Like, I'm just curious what you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Nobody's asked me that before. Do I do. I do still identify as an outsider, and I recognize that I have a lot more insider privilege because I have insights and knowledge and a lot of experience at this point, right? And so I can help people to navigate as an insider, and I can navigate as an insider. But I have always felt like an outsider. I'll tell you. I was at an alumni event earlier this year, and so two things happened. One, there was a party, and they had asked people to submit pictures of us as undergrads, as students. And one of my classmates was uploading like tons of pictures, and she sent a link to everybody. And she's like, "Hey, everybody, like these are the pictures that I uploaded." And I was like, "Oh, it's going to be really fun to look at the pictures, but I won't be in any of them." Right. And I just assumed, I was like, oh, I won't be in any of them. And so then I went and I started going through them, and I was actually in a bunch of the pictures. Right. And we hung out and we were friends, and I was just like, oh, like they included me. And I had this like, oh, wow. Right. Like it was a boost. It was a moment of like, I can't believe that I was included. That was really cool. Right. And that's this year. Right. Like that's a couple of months ago. At that same event, there was a gala. And at the gala, they had a photo booth. And so you could come in and like do like the funny hats and the signs and different things like that and do the photo booth. And so I had done photos with like one of my friends, and I have a classmate who's somewhat famous, right? And he's like, I geek out a little bit when I'm around him. He's absolutely brilliant. And he's, he's popular and, and that kind of thing. And so we spent some time together over the course of the weekend. And then at some point I grabbed him and I was just like, oh, like you have to make sure that you go take like funny pictures, in the photo booth. And he was like, oh yeah, absolutely. And then we like walked in that direction together. And then as he was standing there, what went through my head was like, well, he doesn't want to take pictures with me. And,
Mm.
and I literally allowed it to pull me out of the space. And I faded out of the room
Mm.
and removed myself from like it was just the two of us standing in the line. And I like just sort of slid out of the room. And then at some point he kind of looked up and he looked around and then he walked away.
He didn't want to
And
do it alone.
he didn't want to do it alone. He actually wanted to take the picture with me, I'm assuming.
Hmm.
But the part of me that felt like an outsider was just like, well, he doesn't want to take the picture with me. And I acted on it. And I removed myself from that space because I was like, well, I don't belong here with him. Like, he's him, right? And it was such a weird thing. And I like I've thought about it a number of times since then, because then you also go through the should have done, should have said, over and over. And I played it over in my head a number of different times. And then at some point I played it over in my head from his perspective. And I'm like, I wonder if he thought that I didn't want to take the picture with him.
Mm.
Right? Like, how did that play out in his head when he looked up and I had just disappeared? You know?
Yes.
But I still, this many years later, this far into my adulthood, this far into my coaching and advising of other people, still carry the idea that I don't belong all the time,
Mm.
all the time, right? And I don't know that I can, I mean, at this point, we're probably beyond um, able to make it go away. But what I can be intentional about is my behaviors, right? I can be intentional about my relationships. I can be intentional about my behaviors. And I can recognize that, like, even if I feel like I don't belong, that I can still take up space. I can still make the decision to show up. I can still make the decision to take the action, whatever it is, and not allow myself to not force myself to be disincluded, right?
Yeah.
Right? So like my goal, the action that I have to continue to take is to keep myself in the story, right? I think there was a whole thing some years back about keeping mom in the picture, right? And so there was this realization there are all these family pictures that were all taken by moms, like years, generations across, all of the different, cultures everywhere, all of these photos taken by moms and lives lived where mom's not in the picture.
Mm.
And so that's like the, sort of literal translation of it, right? But I want to be conscious of making sure that I keep myself in the picture. And however I feel about it, I can still take the action of physically keeping myself in the picture.
That's so powerful, the way that you phrased that or shared that. And I think about just having that extra sensitivity, right? People who haven't had as much experience feeling like an outsider may not be primed for that when they walk into certain spaces. But if you have felt like an outsider, there's always going to be that extra level of vigilance or that extra sensitivity. But look, what you're describing is the power of intentionality, right? To make a different choice than to, go into that self-protective mode, or the natural tendency to kind of remove ourselves from an uncomfortable situation. And and I imagine that your experience has been that when you do that, more often than not, there's a positive benefit to it, right?
Yes. Yes. And that people actually do want you around, and that people do value your experience. They value your knowledge. They value your experience, your expertise. I don't know that I've ever been in a situation where I'm like, oh, I don't belong here. And somebody else has been like, yes, you're right, you don't. Right. You know? And when I do vocalize it, generally the feedback is, no, Naeemah, we absolutely want you to be here. Absolutely, we would love to have you be a part of this. Like, where is Naeemah? We want to make sure we have her voice in the room. And so I get that positive feedback. I get that validation. And one of the things that I have to be intentional about is making sure that like I'm incorporating that into my worldview, that I'm not hearing it and ignoring it, but I'm accepting like, yes, people actually do want me in the room. People do like me, right? And shifting that I think is really important.
Yeah, and this conversation is so personal to me. I wish I had met you 20 years ago because I grew up with a parent that moved every couple of years because of his job, and so I was always the new kid, and I never lived anywhere longer than 2 years. I went to 8 different schools throughout my,
Mhm.
education, and I never felt like an insider anywhere. Even to this day, there's still that feeling of, are they going to accept me? Like, how much do I want to invest of myself?
Mhm.
And these people are in this situation. And just listening to you talk is so inspiring because it reminds me like I get to choose. And as grown-ups, right? Like we actually have more agency over these relationships. And when you're talking about, people generally liking us and accepting us, and if they don't, that's okay. That's on them, right? Like that doesn't mean that we're doing anything wrong. That doesn't mean that we're not worthy. And the right people will accept us for who we are.
Yeah, and we don't like everybody, and everybody doesn't like us, right? And you find the match, right? And that's where you lean in. Kim, I had the same childhood experience. We moved every 2 years. And so I think the distinction for me was the acting meant that I was able to kind of create personas and make people like me because I was like, this is the person that you will like. I would like to present her to you. you know and so it was different, and I think that on some level that sort of it facilitated the idea that like I'm not the person that you will like, I will give you the person that you will like,
Yes.
right? And so that's the work that I have to do. But you and I had a very similar experience, right?
Mhm.
And it has a lasting effect, right? It has a lasting impact.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I love the idea that the feeling of being an outsider never goes away, but it doesn't have to define how we show up in the world. Like we can make different choices now.
Yes.
And
Yes.
this has been such an inspirational conversation, Naeemah. I can't thank you enough for sharing your story with us and speaking to so many people listening who I'm sure are nodding their heads and feeling very similarly about their own experience. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about you, learn more about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So my the place I hang out is LinkedIn. That's where I think I spend most of my time. And so we'll have the my LinkedIn link in the notes.
Mhm.
And so Naeemah Elias is my name. You can absolutely follow me. You can connect with me. I'm always looking for clients who are interested in transformation work. If you are interested in growing in your career, making a big change in your life and in your career, and need some help kind of thinking through not just how do I update my resume and how do I interview, but how can I be thoughtful about where I want to be and how I want to show up in the world and getting myself from here to there. That's the work that brings me joy and that I get really passionate about. In addition to that, I've been having some really interesting conversations recently around the concept of healing and growth for myself, and then whether I can stay with my team if my team's not healing and growing, right? And so I do the work for the individual to help you with your transformation, but I also can come in and do the work for the team and help with transformation because if your team's toxic, you can't heal and then stay with a toxic team. But I'm working with teams and helping to do transformation around leadership, around sort of cultivation of self, around being intentional about how we grow as professionals and how we grow as teams. And so I can also come in and help your team to grow so that you can stay with your team if that's a place where you want to be.
Oh, I love that. I will definitely make sure your link is in the show notes. And just thank you for the work you're doing. I really appreciate the way you have, taken your story and really become such an inspiration to others. It's just it's so helpful to all of us who are on, on our own journeys.
You're welcome. Thank you. It brings me joy. It brings me absolute joy. Yeah.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.